Well, greetings, everybody. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and this is the second in our series of conversations I'm having to start off this year with our staff writers to find out what's on their minds, what they're working on, and what they see coming around the bend in their respective beats and areas in 2023. Yesterday, I talked with Walter Shapiro, Tim Noah, Grace Seegers, and Daniel Strauss, and today I'm talking to Melissa Gira Grant, Matt Ford, Alex Shepard, and Kate Aronoff, which I believe that makes up all of our staff writers. I hope so anyway, because I don't want to leave anyone out. Hey gang, welcome.
Howdy.
Great, thanks for coming aboard. As with yesterday, I want to start with just talking to each of you individually for a few minutes about what you're working on and what you're looking to, either optimistically or not, for the new year. Let's start with Melissa. Melissa covers LGBTQ issues for us and other civil liberties related issues. Melissa, what's on your radar screen right now?
So yeah, if I had to come up with like a theme for the year where it seems like where we're going, it really seems like this is going to be another year where this theme of protecting children is going to be the narrative around pushing back on LGBTQ rights. So like last year and the year before, unfortunately, it seems like every year there's more and more anti-LGBTQ bills that get introduced in state houses and state legislatures rather. And we have some states like Florida and Texas where that's totally in alignment with where, you know, their governors are. We have other states where for the first time this year, maybe since things have switched, we'll have some hope, like Michigan, for example. Yesterday, there's some really clear messaging from their state legislature that they are not going to entertain these bills this year. So it's not so much, I think, that these bills are going to all fly through and we're going to end 2023 with like 150 terrible new laws. It's more that it's really exhausting people to have to continue to show up to the state legislature, to continue to testify. And many of these states bring their kids with them. In Missouri yesterday, there were 7 anti-LGBTQ bills just in one chamber of the legislature that had a hearing. So it's tiring.
And describe really quickly the nature of a couple of those bills. Like, what are they trying to do?
Sure. So there's a range. Some of them we've seen before, like bills that are attempting to criminalize those who offer or assist in young people accessing gender-affirming care. So hormone replacement therapy, puberty blockers in some cases. And there's actually one state which did pass that law a couple of years ago that's still under legal challenge. So it's not even clear that these bills, if they passed, would survive. But the point is just sort of like throwing a lot of them. So that's one kind of bill that we're seeing all over the place. The new kind of bill this year that we're seeing are these kind of like anti-drag bills, but sort of a misnomer. I mean, they're written so broadly that it could apply to everything from like, you know, having a drag queen story hour in a community that young people could attend, like at a public library, to adults, you know, just convening, you know, like if you paid a trans person to come and give a lecture at a university, for example, that could fall afoul of the law because the law is really prescribing gender normativity in a way that I've never really seen before. And again, like I think it's like each law isn't so important as just sort of this like story that they're pushing, which is that like children are under some new threat that requires like all of this mobilization. And the right is talking about it far more than the left. You know, it continues to be the case with media coverage of these bills. You're more likely going to see that on Fox than on MSNBC, for example. It's a huge story for them, but not so much on the side of folks who would be defending these rights.
Yeah, and speaking of those folks, what is your assessment of the defense of trans rights and LGBTQ rights? Is it you know, is it as smart and vigorous as it needs to be?
So there's kind of two pieces, I guess I would split it into. Like one is how the state-based LGBTQ rights groups are responding. So folks like Equality Texas and their counterparts in different states who I've spent some time with. And what I'm seeing new this year is this attempt to sort of wrestle with the fact that, you know, we've said every year there's more and more bills. The fight is getting harder and harder. Is there a way to sort of let people know that don't freak out essentially about every single bill that gets proposed, that this is part
Yeah.
of sort of this like larger strategy. And is there a proactive way to push back? And the proactive way to push back, I think, falls more sort of on legislatures more broadly and the public more broadly. And there's some depressing signs there, to be honest. I don't know if folks saw the stories in the New York Times over the last few days that are, attempting to sort of create this idea that there's all of these trans children all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork who are being affirmed by teachers and getting medical care that is too easy for them to get. None of these things are true. These are all right-wing talking points, but they're being treated as sort of the reality of things, even coming from liberal columnists like Michelle Goldberg, for example. And I'm seeing in that this sort of narrative forming that there are liberal parents who have like important concerns about their children, and I don't dispute that at all. But that if the only people they can sort of bring their skepticism about their children's gender identity is to these right-wing anti-trans groups, then we're going to lose them. And I don't think that that's the response that's going to make a difference here. Certainly not in legislation, and it's certainly going to make people's lives worse. And I think, what it would be great to see, and a more powerful response would be, those kids are actually far more under threat in a state like Florida, for example, where their teachers could be penalized if they don't out them to their parents, or in states where schools now are under so many onerous review requirements for things like classroom libraries that teachers have had to just close down their classroom libraries for fear that a book would create outrage. So that's, I think, where the fight is. And I think sort of drawing attention to the fact that like that is the actual fight that's going on right now. And then that is the place where people could step up and make a difference, monitoring what's going on in their own communities and framing it in this broader question right now of the right sort of, trying to bully people through children.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned libraries. We're going to talk about that for sure. We're going to come back to that. I'm going to keep circling around right now though. So Matt Ford covers the courts for TNR in the Supreme Court. Did a cover story last November's issue on John Roberts and how Roberts had basically lost control of the court. And how we talk about it's the Rehnquist court, it's the Warren court. This is really hardly the Roberts court. It's it's the Leonard Leo court or something. So Matt, you've really been so laser focused on this turn of the court since Trump put his 3 people on there. What's coming down the pike this year? What are they hearing? And when we hear that spate of decisions in June, what should we be dreading?
So there are a few major ones that really stand out. And, every term we have a couple of cases that are sort of the ones that get mainstream national attention. The court hears about 60 to 70 of them each year. This year we have, I think, a slightly above average level of cases that I think are worthy of national attention. The flagship cases, I think, are the ones that involve race and elections. And there are 3 that really stand out there. One is Merrill v. Milligan. This is the one where race and elections coincide. Alabama is challenging a redistricting order issued by a federal judge in that state to redistrict that state to allow for a second majority Black district to comport with the Voting Rights Act requirements on racial gerrymandering. This is a case where the Supreme Court and the conservative majority, based on oral arguments last fall, they appear poised to sort of rewrite the Voting Rights Act to shift it away from the more favorable ground that plaintiffs already had and to something that would allow states much greater leeway to write congressional districts that may be racially discriminatory. This is something that we've already seen from the court. We saw it in Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee last 2 terms ago, where the state signed off on a radical rewriting of another section of the Voting Rights Act. At the same time, I think the case that a lot of people are really focusing on the election front is Moore v. Harper, and that's the independent state legislature theory. The idea that state legislatures have this sort of super authority to pass election laws, that governors can't veto them, that state courts can't review them, makes them only accountable to, really the Supreme Court in some sense, but federal courts in general. This is something that a lot of people are watching closely, myself included, because of the potential for mischief. We know that elections in America don't function as smoothly as they used to. We know that especially after 2020, there's always a chance of malfeasance. There's a chance of people trying to overturn the will of the people. And there's a lot of fear that the independent state legislature doctrine could be used to further that. And then on race, there's the case, the Students for Fair Admission cases. Those are both challenging affirmative action policies in colleges and universities, both public and private. Now, the Supreme Court there, that's something that John Roberts, we talked last term about how he was sort of parting ways with his colleagues. John Roberts has been laser focused on these issues, on sort of taking race out of the sphere of American jurisprudence and making it something that courts can't really wrestle with. So I fully expect him, in contrast to last term, to be much more of a driving figure in these decisions, because I think that he's much closer to his priorities when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, when it comes to affirmative action. And we'll see, it's a coin flip now, whether they'll side with the states on the independent state legislature theory.
Yeah, let's focus on Roberts for just another couple minutes here. I'm sure everybody watching this knows there are things on which Roberts sides with the liberals on the court. But where is he, pretty committed to a deeply conservative view? What are the issues on which we should not be hopeful that Roberts is going to do that?
Sure. Well, one of them is federalism. Roberts is very concerned about issues where the federal government seems to be overpowering against the states. He's somebody who's had a skeptical eye towards, the regulatory state, as conservatives describe it, the idea that federal agencies can issue broad policies. We saw that last term in West Virginia v. EPA, where the court had a major decision that struck down. It's complicated to explain, but they struck down an EPA policy from under the Obama administration that wasn't really enforced. It was a clear effort to sort of shift the goalposts on federal and state policy to make it harder for federal agencies to act where Congress hasn't explicitly in black letter law said you absolutely can do this. Federal laws are written vaguely, so federal agencies typically have some wiggle room. Roberts is trying to close that. The other one, and I talked about this in the magazine piece, is race. And we know that from the Seattle school desegregation case in the 2000s. Roberts is somebody whose view on race is that the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to just sort of move past it. He says is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But he's someone who thinks that the federal courts have no role here, that they can't, that there shouldn't be an option in them necessarily to deal with issues involving race. And he's somebody who wants to sort of defang federal courts from doing this. We saw that in the Shelby County case, most notably the Voting Rights Act case that gutted preclearance a few years ago. And it's something I expect to continue through this term. Those are the issues where, despite differing on, in some cases, procedural pathways, despite differing with the other justices on necessarily the speed and manner in which he gets to conservative rulings, those two issues are ones where I think he is in lockstep with his colleagues.
Yeah, there's a long, as you know, tradition of conservative justices deciding that that's not our territory. That's non-justiciable and we can't decide on that. That's left to the political process. It hasn't done this country much good over the decades and centuries. Kate Aronoff. Kate covers climate for TNR. Did a terrific job last year at Glasgow, among other things. And on this obviously very pressing issue, Kate, where do you see things headed? Still muted. Do I have to improvise while Kate unmutes? I'll say a little bit more. There's, of course, we all know that the Inflation Reduction Act, her settings aren't letting her talk. Well, let's come back to Kate, okay? And see if we can get that fixed up. Alex Shepard, hi.
Hey.
Alex covers, he covers politics and he covers media and he covers culture, sort of that intersection where all those things fall together. Alex, what are you looking at?
Well, yeah, everything. I'm TNR's utility player, middle infielder. Well, I mean, yeah, right now I actually just finished taping an episode of the New Republic's great podcast, The Politics of Everything, about the kind of gas stove freak out on the American right. I feel like similar to what Melissa was talking about earlier, watching the sort of the rights the growing number of fronts on the culture war has been one of the obsessions of mine. I think it's also a direct reaction to what happens when you have a political party that's abandoned policymaking as a means of governance and instead relies entirely on grievance and outrage. I'm looking now for, well, I'll have to send this to you momentarily, but I've been working on a piece about Elon Musk, but also about the sort of larger media ecosystem that sort of propped him up for many years. And in many ways, he was kind of the last survivor of the kind of glowing tech coverage that was in most mainstream outlets for several decades. And I think that part of Musk's radicalization over the last few years, some of it, comes from the fact that he's always had a certain set of reactionary and kind of libertarian-ish politics, but I think another is him growing angrier and angrier at a mainstream media that's actually started to finally do its job when it's covering tech billionaires, among others. It's ceased to treat them as these kind of Randian heroes of American business, and instead treats them as people who are having an often insidious effect on our daily lives.
I think of the rise of the right-wing media, which, has happened during basically my adult lifetime. When I was in college, there wasn't such a thing.
You were listening to Bob Grant in college, Mike?
Well, yeah, okay, Bob Grant, fair enough. And maybe
my
two
guy.
other cranks. And I actually did the Bob Grant show once or twice, only under certain conditions. But Limbaugh came on the air, and then his imitators, and then fast forward to Fox News, which started in 1996, the fall of 1996. And so I've just seen this thing mushroom and mushroom and mushroom to the point where I don't know. I think the right-wing media has more ability to influence political events in the United States today than the mainstream media. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think one of the things that's also happened is, I was just talking about this on the podcast, but I think there used to be a kind of organic process that essentially started with talk radio, particularly with Limbaugh, but again, also with, I don't know why I keep talking about Bob Grant, who was a New York radio host in the 80s and 90s, a kind of cantankerous fella. There's some good clips on YouTube of him yelling at people. But, I think there used to be a kind of organic process by which radio hosts in particular, particularly call-in radio hosts, would talk to people. They would kind of gauge what did and didn't generate anger and outrage among their callers, and they would kind of hone in on it slowly. And when you had Fox News, then finally these things would like percolate up. They would come up into magazines, and then finally they would get on Fox. And this could take weeks. I mean, usually it would take days, but there would be a sort of slow outrage cycle. And now it's happening in like 6 to 10 hours. Like, I mean, we just did this episode about gas stoves. I mean, that feels like it happened months ago. It's like 10 days ago, because now we're talking about if candy should be attractive or not. And these things just sort of cycle through. And again, like, I think there is an element of distraction there, but again, I think it's part of a larger kind of cultural reactionary moment that, again, I think the most damaging areas is the area that Melissa was talking about earlier, particularly involving healthcare for trans children. But there's also a kind of, I tend to often cover the sort of funhouse mirror aspect of it, the kind of absurd culture war that I think sustains it at a kind of simmering boil.
And what is the mainstream media not doing in response to this that it ought to be doing? I know we could talk about that till 3:00 this afternoon, but you have a minute and a half for present purposes.
I mean, probably a lot of things, but the mainstream media is not well set up to wage a culture war, and it probably shouldn't be. I think there's a larger obsession on the left about if the left is not doing what it should be doing to either build up a sort of comparable apparatus. I don't know if that would even be possible. I mean, to some extent, it's just too diffuse on the left, I think in general, the media has gotten a lot better at covering the danger of figures on the right, particularly folks like Tucker Carlson, who again is often a figure of fun for me, but is somebody who also yesterday was calling, Antifa the armed wing of the Democratic Party, right? I think a lot of the things that he's doing preemptively are used to justify right-wing political violence. I think taking that more seriously is the sort of mainstream media's larger issue without, again, building it up. And I think that's something that's really hard to do, particularly with somebody like Carlson, who's at once a sort of demagogic and somewhat terrifying figure and a ridiculous one at the same time.
Folks watching might want to know about Alex's terrific cover story on Tucker Carlson that ran early last year with one of our more striking covers of recent vintage. So you might want to check that out. Okay, now we have Kate, right?
I believe so. Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay, good. I'm
All
so
right,
sorry
Kate.
for the technical difficulties.
No worries. Okay, tell us what we should worry about on the climate front.
Well, no shortage of things to worry
Yeah.
about. In terms of coverage, there's sort of two big trends that I'm focusing on over the next couple of months in particular. So one is as House Republicans sort of settle in, I think they're going to be looking to bring a lot of these sort of festering state level fights to the national level. So the biggest when it comes to climate and energy issues are these various sort of anti-ESG measures, anti-sustainable investment laws that have been percolating out through state legislatures over the past 2 years, helped along tremendously by the American Legislative Exchange Council, by the Heritage Action, a sort of usual suspects crew of think tanks and activists and donors, including people like Leonard Leo from the Federalist Society. So that, the Republicans have said already that they want to hold hearings, they want to bring the asset managers like BlackRock that they're targeting in front of congressional hearings and subpoena them, and really just create a sort of administrative mess. It's unclear to me sort of how much purchase that has, not only because it's unpopular, most people don't really know what ESG is, but also because there's not really a coherent arm of capital that is interested in this fight. The financial sector really doesn't like these bills from, state level banks are really opposed to these bills that are sort of coming out of state capitals, and the fossil fuel industry itself, which these efforts are sort of claiming to be in defense of, themselves are, interested in ESG policies, are sort of looking to tap in particular to the Inflation Reduction Act when it comes to new subsidies for things like carbon capture and storage. So it is unclear sort of how much purchase it will have at the federal level in particular, but the main goal, I think, relevant to what Matt was talking about is sort of regulatory challenges. And ultimately, people seem to think a Supreme Court ruling calling into question the ability of agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission to do anything related to climate. So that seems to be sort of where this is heading, and is the only thing that kind of helps make sense of this very strange new front of climate culture war that's being brewed up. The other thing I'll just say briefly is how the Inflation Reduction Act gets implemented. I think that'll be, at least at the White House level, where a lot of the action is. Ron Klain stepping down is sort of an interesting development on that front. He sort of had the ear of a lot of the sort of climate activists who helped push the IRA forward. Jeff Zients, I think I'm pronouncing that right, is a lot more, has a much less friendly relationship with a lot of the sort of activist left, particularly climate-based.
Yeah.
So there's people like John Podesta who is there, and his job is sort of to muster that forward, and he has closer ties to the sort of climate groups, but that is all to be worked out. And there's very few details as of yet sort of on the table about how all this money goes out the door.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. What should people who are tuned into us here be looking at in terms of specific IRA implementation, most important stuff the next year or two?
Yeah, there's a couple different fronts. I mean, I think one is the building electrification piece, which is ironic that the gas stoves have gotten so much so much press, considering how little money there actually is for electrification in the IRA. The much bigger sort of chunk of that of IRA funds is for electric vehicles, and that, you know, I think the big outstanding question is around trade, at least, you know, as far as I can see, and whether these subsidies, which were built to prioritize American manufacturing, can actually really roll out the door, considering there is such little battery manufacturing and car manufacturing taking place currently in the United States that would qualify under the sort of subsidies that are laid out. And people are of different opinions about that, but it looks like that will be a sort of big issue in terms of actually getting these laws sort of in place, whether they will be able to use components from Europe, for instance, whether South Korea will be able to qualify, whether any sort of Chinese inputs will be able to make it through. It's really forcing a lot of very interesting weedsy trade questions to the forefront.
What are the activist folks, Sunrise people and so forth, what are they pushing for now? I mean, there's a lot that didn't make it into the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's just a lot of other fronts on which this battle needs to be waged. So what are their priorities right now?
Yeah, I don't know if there is a sort of holistic answer to what that looks like. So on the one hand, I think there is a lot of pessimism about just how small and modest the Inflation Reduction Act is compared to what was the sort of origin of this package, right? Which was the Green New Deal, which was this really sort of transformative investment package. These are subsidies for corporations. It's good that they're in place, but it's a very different vision than what people had in mind. And then, you know, what I always hear from people, especially when there's a Republican Congress or you know, shared government, is we focus on the states, right? We'll try to pass what we can at the state level. So, you know, folks will be paying attention to New York, to California, places where you can really get climate policy through. So there will be some re-emphasis on that, but I do think it is sort of a strategizing kind of back to the drawing board moment for a lot of climate groups, in sort of orienting toward this bizarre new era where we actually have something like climate policy on the books.
We'll get there perhaps one of these days, but not in the next 2 years anyway. Melissa, let's go back to you and talk about books and the piece you're working on now for the upcoming print issue. This book banning stuff that's going on is like really bad, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's an understatement, honestly. Like the more I dig into it, the more time I've spent talking to folks working in libraries. It's pretty staggering. And I think a lot of it actually isn't like percolating up into public view, because the fear, like Alex was laying out, you know, there's an organization on the right, not just to spread these stories, but also to get people activated, whether it's, you know, groups on Facebook, like by groups like Moms for Liberty or others, to actually not just have people challenge books, but they're going into libraries and harassing the library workers themselves. And so it's part of what's going on right now that I'm seeing, and I hope that I don't see many other places, but I'm seeing throughout one of the states that I focused on, is just the sheer number of challenges to books that libraries also have to deal with. I found one small library that had 150 book challenges. And it's very clear that there are mechanisms on the right for distributing these lists of the books that should be challenged. But at the end of the day, it still is like kind of an attempt to crash the library system. It takes a lot of effort on the part of librarians to respond to these challenges. Sometimes they have to essentially create like a book report to defend every book that was challenged, and it's transformed the profession. It's transformed the institution already, unfortunately.
What are the? I mean, it's not catcher in the rye these days, but I gather there's a lot of like young adult LGBTQ books. There's a lot of books directed at LGBTQ youth and things like that. Is there a general category of books that are most likely to be targeted?
Yeah, we've seen over the last like 2 or 3 years, the ALA has been tracking this, and also Pan America, and consistently the two sort of like broad categories of books that are most challenged are those that have, excuse me, LGBTQ characters or themes, and also themes around race or books by authors of color. So, and sometimes overlapping. One of the most challenged books across the country right now is a graphic memoir called Genderqueer about a non-binary person of color coming out. And that is, a book that came out in 2019, I believe. And, it's just continues to be more and more challenged every year. It's also influencing libraries thinking about what books to add to their collections now, because there's this fear that this isn't stopping anytime soon. So even though these challenges don't often succeed, they're still having this chilling effect, unfortunately, for LGBTQ books and also books by authors of color for young folks.
Yeah. Alex, you cover the publishing industry some for us. Is there anything to add from that perspective on this debate, on this situation?
There's been an effort, I think, to try to come up with ways to combat this, largely unsuccessfully. Because again, it's, as Melissa was mentioning, it's this kind of death by a thousand cuts thing. I think one of the larger fears is that it will just kind of have a chilling effect because library sales are so important for books in general, and that you'll slowly see a kind of whittling down of these types of books where there has been a genuine explosion. I think there's also a kind of strange irony in this, in that, Banned Books Week has been this kind of big thing for a long time within the publishing industry as a kind of self-congratulatory moment, but it was really not, it really wasn't an issue for the most part. When I used to be a humble publishing reporter and blogger, you could always do pretty well by being like, oh, there's some crazy challenge, and some library in East Tennessee, but for the most part, these were pretty isolated things. It was like one mother of a very embarrassed child somewhere who didn't want their kid to read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks or something. And I think what we see now is this very, very organized and centralized way of trying to deal with that. I think, PEN America has become, for me, one of the most interesting groups that's trying to combat it. And partly just because I think being a civil liberties organization at this point, requires a lot of kind of pretzeling between various political groups and alignments. So I think, they're in a really interesting space, but in general, we've seen kind of symbolic donations from large publishers, but those publishers, I think, are freaking out about their own things right now. Their workers are unionizing, and they're trying, they're looking at, I think, the same uncertain economic future that a lot of other large corporations are as well.
But Penn has really stepped up here.
Yeah, I think they've been one of the most important organizations, but I think they're very interesting to me, because we should, this is a story idea almost, but they're very interesting to me because I think that they have also taken a much more critical view of protests against right-wing speakers at college campuses as well. I think these things largely align with their vision, but I think from a sort of political and even a fundraising perspective, Suzanne Nossel and the people over there, I think are in a unique and I think a quite complicated position.
Yeah, that's true. Suzanne is the director of Penn, for those who don't know Suzanne Nossel. Excuse me again, Matt. Let's circle back to you. Kate mentioned something earlier about efforts to force cases before the Supreme Court that would basically dismantle the administrative state. Talk in more detail about that, and if that's coming down the pike anytime soon, or there are cases that people should be aware of, and talk about the extremely far-reaching, potentially cataclysmic to me ramifications of this body of jurisprudence.
Sure. So there's a ruling out there from the 1980s called Chevron. I don't remember the other party, but it led to a doctrine known as the Chevron doctrine. And the premise of that is that when a federal agency sits down and says, "Hey, can we do something?" They look at federal law and they decide, "Yeah, that's within our ambit." The Chevron doctrine's premise is that federal courts will defer to that federal courts will step back and let agencies sort of decide when and how they can best use their regulatory authority under the statutes that authorize it. This has received a lot of pushback in recent years from conservatives on a few different fronts, but most notably on the environmental front, because they say it gives too much authority to agencies to regulate them. which is unsurprising because they don't want agencies to regulate. And so we've seen a sort of nibbles of litigation working their way through the courts, trying to lure the justices into taking up a case that would allow them to revisit the Chevron doctrine. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, why do I need to know about this case? This is some obscure administrative law thing. If that passes, the decision of whether or not an agency can regulate something when federal statutes are vague, and unfortunately many federal statutes are vague, would fall to the
They're
judges.
all vague.
Yeah,
Even the ones that are 4,000 pages are vague.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild how big the federal code is, because
Yeah.
we don't even know how many criminal laws there are in this country right now. They tried to count them once. The Library of Congress failed. Anyways, when those laws are vague, when they say Congress can, or that the EPA can regulate a pollutant, or can regulate a dangerous gas or something, they want judges instead of agencies to say, okay, this is what a pollutant is. This is what a dangerous gas is. This is what a workplace hazard is. And behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, all other things being equal, that is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but they're pushing this in a context where Donald Trump named a quarter of judges to the federal courts and a third of judges to the Supreme Court. And so you have a backdrop of federal judges who are strongly influenced by conservative ideological movement politics, to deliver rulings that would be maximally favorable to corporations, to the little, the poor, struggling coal baron who just wants to release, ungodly pollutants into the atmosphere, but the big mean EPA won't let him. This is sort of a sort of judicial doctrine that will, or overturning a judicial doctrine that would prevent that. Now, I can't speak at this moment to a specific case that would come up. I know that there are routinely cases that come up. But we have at least 4 of the justices, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh, who are on board with revisiting Chevron. I think Roberts has expressed some interest in it before, but I don't think he's come out and said it. That's, we know in the Supreme Court today, all it takes is 5. 5 can do just about anything. And so I think that it's only really a matter of time before a case does come before the Supreme Court. And if it does, I would not bet the farm on Chevron surviving in its current form.
Yeah, Kate, we're really focusing in here on a big overlap between your purview and Matt's. This really will affect environmental policy potentially more than anything else. Tell folks from your perspective the role that the federal courts play for ill and hopefully sometimes for good in terms of making and enforcing environmental policy.
Yeah, and just to add briefly onto what Matt was saying, when the West Virginia versus EPA decision came down this summer, people thought the sort of worst case scenario would be overturning the Chevron deference. That didn't happen, but the federal government and these sort of slightly broader, as the right argues at least, interpretations of federal statute are a big part of Biden's approach to climate change, which is a sort of all of government approach that tasks individual agencies with figuring out both how climate will, affect the federal government on sort of a risk analytical way, but also how to reduce emissions. And so the sort of legal scholars I've talked to after West Virginia versus EPA see one of the most likely challenges to the sort of challenge that Roberts seemed to put out to bring cases under major questions doctrine would be a challenge to this proposed Security and Exchange Commission ruling on requiring companies to report their emissions. So I won't get into the details of which types of emissions, but there's one category of emissions which is very controversial to report. And so you've already seen the sort of right-wing legal movement making hay about this even proposed ruling being in defiance of major questions doctrine. So that will probably come up, but that is sort of what we've got. The IRA was not as big as people had hoped, and you can have a transformative level of investment to really reduce emissions sharply. the IRA will help, but what will pull the weight and sort of what a lot of people in the climate world are hoping for is to have regulations that will do that on things like methane, on sort of regulatory disclosures like the SEC is pushing for. And so a ruling that overturns Chevron or, gets at the same goal through any number of ways could be really threatening to the administration's ambitions of, reducing, of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, which is massively ambitious in any case, even if everything was sort of going right. But is really hard to imagine meeting that goal without having the full sort of weight of the administrative state behind it.
Yeah. They never stop. They always find a new case to pursue, and they always find a new avenue, and they always find a new strategy. Let me broaden it out a little bit here. We're sort of winding toward the end. And by the way, if any of you watching this has a question, please post it to the chat board, and we'll try to relay it and see what people say. But let me ask you all this broad question. Where do we stand? Where does this democracy stand right now? I feel, and I guess it's probably conventional wisdom, that we pulled back from the cliff a little bit last November. Trump's people lost. There weren't really any people who seriously challenged their results. It seemed to normalize a bit, but I think there's still a lot to worry about. Melissa, you want to have a go at that first?
Yeah, I think when I think of the last election, honestly, I think of Abbott and I think of DeSantis, as much as there was a repudiation of some of the most grotesque, anti-trans, anti-drag talking points, even some pushback on a lot of the broader culture war stuff too, whether it was around masking, anti-CRT, you could read the election in one way as a repudiation of those, but the day-to-day circumstances, particularly for young people in Florida and Texas, have gotten worse. And I feel like that's what I'm looking at, is this somebody like Carrie Lake, who I covered a lot in Arizona, and we could 100% assume that she was going to challenge her election results, and she did. And it didn't really amount to much, and there weren't the same kind of protests outside Maricopa County's election facilities that we saw in 2020. And I think those are all really good signs. But the kinds of people who coalesced around those protests are still out there looking for fights to attach themselves to. Right now, it's libraries and school board meetings still. Yeah. So the kind of permission that someone like DeSantis gives to those kinds of, political groups are willing to do political violence, that seems like a scarier situation than we were in some ways than 2 years ago.
Alex?
I think I tend to think of things, or I see sort of two things happening simultaneously. I think one is the amount of data that we've had is actually pretty slim. In the post-Trump world, we've only really had 3 elections, one of which Donald Trump was running in. But it does seem in general that, I still tend to believe that a lot of the things that we were most afraid of in a sort of post-Trump world actually are kind of narrowly fit Donald Trump and not that many other people that, I spend a lot of time following Ron DeSantis, and he just doesn't seem to have the juice to me in that kind of way. If you're looking for demagogic figures, and the types of people that we've seen who most closely emulate Trump have tended to humiliate themselves in a variety of ways, but electorally speaking. And that, I think, largely makes me feel more confident, or at least that you're okay, we have this kind of weird, superpower, quasi-fascistic figure, but, his appeal is relatively narrow. At the same time, I think the replacement level Republican has gotten significantly more radical in the same time. I think the House, Kevin McCarthy's shambolic, very funny, utterly humiliating quest to become House Speaker was both very funny, but it was also a kind of reflection of this, that the larger Republican caucus has moved right. And I think in general, even though the ultimate people who are kind of pushing him that way, there were only a handful of them, well, the larger caucus, I think, is still largely okay with a lot of those changes. So I think, and again, DeSantis and Youngkin are being presented even by a lot of mainstream figures as sort of more normal, more rational figures. I think the very presence of Donald Trump has a kind of laundering effect on a lot of people that
Yeah,
that I find quite disturbing. So for me, I tend to feel hope, and that I think the contagion of Trumpism does seem to be largely limited in some ways to Donald Trump. I don't know if anyone could foment a coup with the same level of near success as he did, and yet I do think the larger Republican Party, the sort of its rightward transformation was dramatically accelerated over the last 6 years in ways that I think will take a long time for us to figure out.
yeah, totally. Matt Ford.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would bring this back. I have two thoughts on this, and the first one is more closely hewn to my beat, which is the courts and stuff. The courts, to their credit, have not really ever embraced any of the coup stuff or the political violence stuff, which is understandable because federal judges, independently of all this, often face a risk of violence, and so they're naturally averse to that. In addition to the just moral aversion to political violence in general. The Supreme Court never embraced any of these theories. They never ruled in favor of anybody during the 2020 election on these sort of wild conspiracy theories. They did some, garden variety election law disputes, but nothing of this magnitude. All of that is caveated by we don't know what's going to happen necessarily in Moore v. Harper, the independent state legislature theory. That will matter not only because if they sign off on it or some variation of it, it could increase the chance of mischief, but it will also send a signal that the court could be interested in that stuff. And I think we'll see a much more concerted effort, if not to bring cases along those lines, than to develop circumstances of muddled disputes where cases could be brought to the court in general. The second thought I have is hinged on one word Melissa said, which is permission. And the idea that there are elements on the American right that are creating sort of permission structure for political violence. And I think that's absolutely the case. And I've written a few times how, as much as it might not seem like it, we have just been extraordinarily lucky over the past 6 years or so that nobody has managed to kill an elected official. We've gotten really, really close a few times. We had the congressional baseball shooting. The FBI has stopped at least 2 or 3 plots I can think of to bomb or assassinate various Democratic officials. We had, I have no doubt what would have happened if any of the January 6th protesters had actually managed to get their hands on a lawmaker. I think that, in the future, I'm not necessarily worried about, Donald Trump crossing the Rubicon with a few legions. I'm more worried about sort of low-grade political violence that Republican officials and that conservative media figures are sort of explicitly, if not explicitly welcoming, then implicitly creating a set of circumstances to justify it. Whether it's because they're coming after our kids, they're stealing our democracy, they're doing this, doing that, patriots rise up. I worry that in the future we'll see just a sporadic return to assassinations, bombings, things like that, and that it will take one big one to sort of set that in motion.
Yeah, seems chillingly correct. Kate?
Yeah, I would agree with what Matt said, and I think the sort of obvious headline, which you named, Michael, is just the Republican Party becoming a lot more honest over the last couple of years about being a minoritarian project to really hold on to power among a very small, wealthy, white group of people, and that project is out in the open now, even if it had been sort of percolating for a long time. I guess to sort of run counter to my beat of being a downer about most things as a climate reporter, will say that one thing that is somewhat hopeful is just how unmoored a lot of this, really sort of openly authoritarian project seems to be increasingly from big arms of capital that have been very happy with a lot of these things, a lot of very anti-democratic projects for a long time. And on climate, that's especially clear just because there is so much money to be made. And fossil fuel companies realize that, sort of older legacy industries realize there's money to be made on an energy transition. And so now you have this very bizarre thing happening where there are forces which, relied on corporate money to put forward very unpopular priorities on the right that are running away from their corporate donors And I don't know how long that can sustain itself. These really sort of authoritarian projects have relied, for the most part, on just getting tremendous unlimited funds of money, or unlimited pots of money from ideological donors for a long time. And there's just this bizarre split happening where you have this sort of like, a segment of the Republican Party, which is really not speaking on behalf of any coherent set of industries. And so without that kind of big money support, I guess I think, very optimistically, some of this stuff could run out of steam. But I think, that doesn't mean we don't have to worry about the kinds of low-level violence that Matt has talked about, and this broader sort of challenge to, any number of things from the administrative state on down to how, people live their lives as queer people, as people of color, on the just sort of day-to-day basis. That is very, very troubling. And yeah, there's a sigh of relief, I think, that the Republican Party is such a mess right now. But sort of longer term, things seem pretty bleak, not least of which, not least because the planet is warming very rapidly.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you guys a couple of pundity kind of questions, sort of along those lines. Scale of 1 to 10, what's the likelihood Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee in 2024? And if not him, who? Melissa?
Oh, dear God. I mean, my personal feelings or what's actually going to happen. I honestly don't know. I find it really hard to speculate. 5.5, 6 that he'll make it. I mean, I don't think we're going to see that cast of a bazillion Republicans like we did in 2016.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. Yeah. Alex?
I think I'm going to say 9. Maybe, 9. I like to make big predictions that don't end up being true, but I do think that just a even if it lasts, if he can make it through 6 to 8 primaries with 6 to 8 challengers, then like he's got it in the bag at that point. I think again, DeSantis is, I say this as a proud 5'7" person, a guy who loves, little industrious midfielders. Ron DeSantis is 5'7". He's not going to be the nominee.
Matt?
Well, this is The Price is Right. I would say 10 just to ensure I get to move on to the next round.
Yeah.
But I think I would actually rank it somewhere around a 7.
Yeah.
I think Ron DeSantis has the charisma of like cardboard once you actually see him talk for more than 5 seconds at a time. And Trump, for all his malevolence, did have a sort of sense of charisma that really resonated among conservatives. He had a sense of humor. Ron DeSantis is the most joyless person I think I've seen in modern American politics.
Yeah.
He could, relate to a crowd. I think that the deciding factor is whether or not he gets indicted for something, and in which case I think you'll see a lot of the donor class on the right move towards an alternative. But by the same token, I'll just add that I think the chances of him actually getting elected to the presidency, barring some sort of major world-shaking black swan event we can't see, like the pandemic or something, I think is basically close to zero. I think that the American electorate has shown time to time again that absent some sort of bizarre outside force, they're not really interested in what Trump is selling. And they're very willing to go to the polls to do it for, Joe Biden, who is, whatever you think about Joe Biden, he's not exactly a guy that people are clamoring over the fence to rally and root for. He's been a more effective president than I think a lot of people expected, but he's not a guy who engenders a sort of zeal, and yet he can still defeat Donald Trump. I don't see Donald Trump winning in 2024, and I'm just worried about what happens when that happens.
Yeah. Kate?
Yeah, I think I'd put it at an 8 at the risk of being, sort of middling and copping out. But yeah, I don't think Donald Trump has a great chance of being elected. I will say that if there is a recession at some point between now and 2024, that math probably looks a lot worse. And anything could happen. That's the lesson of the last 3 years. But I would agree that I don't think there's a natural sort of inheritor to Trump or Trumpism. And there's not really another source of like fire and passion in the Republican Party. Thank God.
Yeah. It's 12:57. I have two audience questions that I want to get to, one for Kate and one for Alex. So if you could both answer these fairly quickly, and then I want to do one last around the horn question of mine. Kate, the question for you is, please address growing police violence against environmental activists and activists in general, turning nonviolent civil disobedient activists into perceived threats, etc.
Yeah, this has been a long-standing trend for a while, and just last week saw in very specific terms the first killing by U.S. police forces of a forest defender in Atlanta, just around this proposed Cop City project that you can read about in my most recent piece. But this has been brewing for a long time, specifically the push to label anyone engaged in a environmental or climate protest against pieces of infrastructure in particular as domestic terrorists for a long time. But since 2017, 2018, ALEC has really pushed forward a series of bills to deeply, deeply criminalize protest around pieces of critical infrastructure. And so that, I think, will only sort of ramp up. I don't see a reason why that would stop. There's, I think, 39 bills that have been passed over the last couple of years, and people are being killed. People have been killed before for protest, of course, and for these sorts of protests, people like Judy Berry. But it's very worrying, especially as that sort of coincides with all of the right-wing culture war stuff and escalating political violence in a more meta sense here.
And Alex, quickly, someone is asking, speaking of big predictions, what do you think about next year's Nobel?
I typed in Gerald Murnane and then I realized that won't be the case. We've had too many English laureates recently. The two I'll put now are, I think I said it last year. Well, I also said Annie or no, so that counts as a win for me. But Jan Fosse, his Septology just came out. It's an incredible book. There has not been a Scandinavian laureate since 2011 when Thomas Tranströmer won. I think he would be a good shot. I also was trying to think of the right one, but Jan Lianqi, I butchered the pronunciation, the Chinese satirical novelist. It would be the second Chinese laureate in 8 years with a sort of, we'll say, complicated relationship to the Chinese state, named Yan to win, or Yan, however you want to say it. But there have been very few Asian laureates. Chinese literature itself seems like where you would probably go at this point. So those two.
Yeah, that's a good tip. We're talking obviously about the Nobel Prize for Literature, not for peace.
Yes.
Okay. So
Donald Trump will win that.
Yeah. Right. Let's go around the horn with my last question, and it's time to wrap up, but just quickly. Most of this discussion has been a little pessimistic. Give people something that you're hopeful about. Start with you, Alex.
Oh God, I'm not hopeful about anything. No. I mean, I think in general, we've seen a kind of counter mobilization that I was worried would fade, I think, among Democrats and people at the left, that, even post resistance, that actually does seem to be following a sort of broad set of liberal and pro-democratic principles. That's one thing. And I think there's a bunch of interesting stuff happening in antitrust. I think the Google lawsuit is an enormous step forward. I think if Biden does get reelected, I think we're going to see some very, very useful antitrust legislation happening soon.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful on that front. Kate, you already said one hopeful thing, but do you have another tucked away?
Just that the US and Europe right now are competing over who can offer green industries more money is nice, and it's nice to see the EU sort of abandoning its more like doctrinaire order liberalism in favor of trying to coax green industries into growing, which is a sum positive. There's a lot complicated about it, but I think is better than the alternative.
Matt?
I think the thing that keeps me optimistic is that I think in all but like one or two races, election deniers lost in the midterms. A lot of that can be attributed to good activism and organizing by liberals. But in states like Arizona, you also saw a considerable number of centrists and independents and sort of light Republicans cross-ballot switch to vote them down, even as they elevated other candidates who are more, nominally middle-of-the-road Republicans. That gives me hope that there is a certain amount of people in this country who still value, who aren't necessarily, on the left or anything, who still value American democracy over short-term partisan gain. Unfortunately, none of them seem to be in elected office on the right.
Yeah. Melissa?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off both Matt and Alex. I think this project of like saving democracy, it seemed like it might disappear once Donald Trump was removed from office or out of office or whatever. And it didn't, right? It's still with us. And I think it's like boiled down in a much more material level. And that's what I see animating a lot of the pushback to the anti-library stuff, anti-school stuff, as it's being seen as part of that project and something that's a lot closer to people's day-to-day lives, and, something they can actually like transform maybe much more rapidly than they can the White House.
Well, Melissa, Alex, Kate, Matt, this was great. Thanks for a terrific conversation. Thanks to you folks for tuning in. Please read these wonderful writers and all our other writers, and me if you want, at TNR.com, and get the print magazine or the digital version of the print magazine. It's only $10. You can do it. And thanks for watching us, and stay with us. Thanks.